does it inform social work practices? And one of the more interesting ones here is trauma sensitive and trauma informed schools. And you're seeing some of this in the Midlands of England, in around Lincoln, the development of trauma informed schools. So if you've got children coming in with severe trauma that are problematic, how do you frame education and the role of education to be aware of that and help them develop and learn more effectively? So, treatment and management. So a couple of things that I really want to say about this is, one, if you haven't read this book, go and read it. It's called Assistance from Sexual Offending. It's by Daniela Harris. It's a really good book. Don't do what I did. I was on a flight from Iceland to California, and I was writing a conference paper, and I was reading the book, and the lady beside me on the plane kept looking at me. And I was like, why is she looking at me? You know, you sort of going, have I got something on my face? Is something wrong? And then I realized what I was reading. And so I put it away, but I made a joke, and she didn't laugh. So I'm going to tell you the joke I made, and at least humor me by laughing. I said, don't worry, I'm an academic. It's not a self-help book. She didn't find that amusing. But what we know is about 15 years ago, this really influential guy got off the boat and went to Liverpool. And he was doing his PhD at Cambridge at the time, a guy called Shab Maruna. And Shab Maruna said, for years you've been asking the question of how do I stop you from doing the thing I don't want you to do? And he said, you know what? It's the wrong question. We need to ask the question, why did you stop doing that thing? We know that the vast majority of people desist from offending. And, you know, on the rare occasions, I was asked this once at a job interview. Someone said to me, what's the most influential piece of criminological literature that you've read? And I was like, what? I didn't prep for that. But so I had to come up with something, and I still hold it to this day. One of the most influential studies that you will ever read in your life is David Farrington's The Cambridge Study. When they looked at developmental and life course contributors to offending behavior, offending is a life course issue. We know from research by Farrington and by people like Moffat that there's two types of offenders. There's adolescent limited, who is the bulk, who stop offending, and there's life course persistent, who are a smaller number, but they take up most of prison and probation's time. They're in and out and in and out and in and out of the system as a whole, but the majority desist. The majority of people who commit sexual offenses desist as well. There is this perception that once a sex offender, always a sex offender, and they've got high recidivism rates, and they're always a threat. So a piece of work done by Carl Hansen has basically, he did a meta-analysis, and he has basically demonstrated that over their lifetime, the vast majority of people who commit sexual offenses desist. In the meta-analysis, he found that you can go from being very high risk to low risk within 20 years. So that means risk of sexual offending is dynamic. It's not stable. It's not fixed in space and time. That means people can stop from offending. And what stops people from offending? Community support, realistic management plans, and understanding of their triggers and of their risks. So things like circles can play a role in it. Sex offender treatment programs can play a role in it as well. But one of the things that we also need to think about is what we do around this, around treatment and management. So we spend a lot of time talking about social capital, that actually people need positive social capital, and that's how they're going to change their lives. They need to be influenced by positive people around them. And while I don't dispute that, I think that's only part of the story. So from the drugs literature, there's something called recovery capital. And they talk about it a lot with like heroin withdrawal and alcoholism. And recovery capital basically says, yes, social capital plays a role, but there are other forms of capital that surround the individual that play a role in how they recover. And if we're talking about it from a health perspective, we are talking about recovery. We are talking about people learning to manage their behavior in new ways. So they talk about social, but they also talk about physical, and that's like property. Do you own a house? Do you own a car? How many clients or service users have you worked with that can't get a job because they can't get there? You've got them a job at a warehouse where there's no children and they're not at risk to anyone, but the bus doesn't leave until 9 o'clock and they need to be there for 7 o'clock in the morning. Having a phone, having a computer. So you think about some of the guys that download imagery. How do you give them technology to enable them to get a job and to hold a job while risk managing their capability for going on and finding indecent images and talking online? It's a challenge. So having the physical capital, human capital is your knowledge, skills, and base. What do you bring to the table? We know that the population that we work with is so broad. We know that there's guys who have got PhDs who are judges, but we also know there's guys with borderline learning difficulties that have been bin men and won't necessarily have any qualifications. So actually, what do they have to build their human capital, to build their skills, to build their resources, to build their knowledge base? And then the last one is cultural capital. So this is about communities and the capital that they have within communities and broad-based concepts of what works in societal attitudes, where social is about networks, communities is broad, cultural is broader than that. What is the cultural perspective on these things? And actually, what we see is that all of this feeds in to the integration of people who commit sexual offenses. So the other thing that I would say is I don't believe in reintegration. It's a false economy. Reintegration is about bringing someone back to a place where they were before. You're reintegrating them. That's not what we're in the business of doing. We don't want to take these people back to when they were offending, when they were at their riskiest. We want to integrate them in a new pro-social, productive way into society. And actually, that might be the first time some of these people have actually been integrated in any real way. And that could be a contributing factor to why they offended in the way that they offended in the first place. So desistance, recovery capital, all feed into notions of how you integrate people back into communities again. And so, yeah, that's just I'm not going to go into detail about this. This is just an example of how COSA fits into the recovery capital model. The other thing that, hold on, let me have a drink. The other thing that we're not great at is valuing professional insights. We hear a lot about, oh, you need a randomized control trial. Well, where's your matched samples trial on this? Well, that's only qualitative. That's not really useful. Doing research with professionals on professional attitudes isn't really research. So it's not. We hear a lot of this, and I would dispute that. Because the people at the coalface are the people who have a real understanding of the challenges of integration, of the reality of some of who these individuals are and what they present. They have an understanding of sexual abuse and people who commit sexual abuse. They have an understanding of the treatment. And, this is sort of action learning because you reflect upon what you've been doing and what's worked and what hasn't worked and you change things. Risk management of people who have committed sexual abuse. But you know what the one thing all of this knowledge hasn't been used for? Prevention. You've done a lot of work with people about why they've offended, what their pathways to offending are, how they think about their victims, how they're going to manage themselves, and how they're going to manage the people around them. You also know, because they'll say things like, if there had have been help at this point, I might have stopped. If I had have realized the significance of downloading imagery onto my computer, I might have stopped. I was concerned about my behavior, but there was nowhere to go about this, and there was no one to talk to. So I argue that we need to use all of our information here and put it down here and get professionals to start thinking about how their knowledge base and how their experience of working with these individuals can help prevent sexual abuse, and what can be set up to do some of that secondary work that we have talked a lot about. So how does tertiary prevention inform secondary prevention? Because we know it informs primary prevention, because I'm sure we've all been involved in conversations about, will you go and do a training program for schools, or will you have a look at this advertisement that's going to go out? So we have done some of that primary stuff. So it's about how we do the secondary stuff. So this was a piece of work that myself and some colleagues did a couple of years ago, where we brought together professionals from the field. Because, you know, the idea of secondary prevention is great. We talk about it. We go, yeah, we could do secondary prevention, but it's actually a big deal. And what are some of the real challenges about this? What are some of the things that you need to put in place to be able to do this? Well, one of the biggest ones is the existing framework. If you're getting people to say that I'm going to come forward and say that I'm at risk of committing sexual abuse against someone, you got to have somewhere for them to go. You got to have a service. Otherwise, you're just raising the risk and you're causing more problems. If someone says, okay, I've decided I want help, you go, that's great. Fortunately, we don't have any help for you, but it's good that you've admitted that you've got a problem. That's going to cause significant issues for them and for other people. But also, what is the existing framework? So we have talked about Duncanfeld. Could you really do that in a lot of other places? It's a challenge. And I know it's something that the Safer Living Foundation have really struggled with. What is the legality of this and what does it mean? So in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same everywhere else, we've got some wonderful tabloid papers that offer really insightful and constructive advice. And so the argument in the UK, when you're thinking about policy and practice, is what would the Daily Mail say? And so you have to try and visualize the response. And you can see examples of this. UK government funds schemes to let paedophiles get away with sexual abuse. You can see this rolling out. So you have to do a lot of work around what is the fallout from this. And maybe you don't start with secondary prevention. You start with sexual abuse as a healthcare issue, and then maybe you start with juveniles, and then maybe you move on to something else. So there's a process to it. The other thing is that, so disclosure is important. So in the UK, there's been a couple, so StopSo is phone-based. You will phone up and get a clinician and you will talk to them. So you don't have to meet people straight away. The Safer Living Foundation, you physically go into a building and you meet someone. And a lot of research has been done on the psychology of this disclosure, that actually if you're getting at-risk people to say, I've got a problem and I need help, is doing that face-to-face the best way of doing it? Is doing it over the phone or on the internet the best way of doing it? And we don't know because we haven't done the research, the evaluation. But it's something to think about. What is the practicality of doing this? Okay. So the other thing is about engagement. And I think it's our professional duty. We have to engage with the public and with professionals around this. So many years ago, my PhD was on public and professional attitudes to paedophilia. And the first thing I would say is I learned a valuable lesson. Don't stand on a street corner and ask members of the public what they think about paedophiles. Didn't go very well. Had to do a bit of rethinking. But when you talk to professionals, what you hear is, well, they don't get it. The public don't understand that they're all uneducated. They're all think it's this, they all think it's that. And then my question back to them is, so what have you done to change that? Oh, well, that's not my job. And I disagree with that. I fundamentally disagree with that. My wife keeps taking me to parties because people will ask me what I do. I can clear a kitchen in less than 3 minutes. But I take the long way because people will say, what do you do? I'm an academic. Oh, that's interesting. And then what do you do? Then there's 7 questions in, then it's harder for them to leave. They're stuck there. And it's also good if you get them in a corner. But I think we have a responsibility to talk about this. And so we do a lot of stuff. So I run the sexual abuse blog and the Nota blog as well. So please go and have a look. But actually engaging with the media, we have to do it. So myself and Stuart Alderdice at the Nota conference this year had a piece that came out in the Scottish Herald about actually how we prevent sexual abuse. We have to feed good news stories to the press. And a colleague of mine from Northern Ireland, a lady called Marcella Wallace, did a fantastic job of this. Because she used to run PANI, which was the Northern Ireland equivalent of MAPA, and they kept getting berated. They kept saying, probation's doing a terrible job, risk management is doing a terrible job. And she finally lost her patience and said to the BBC, let's do a documentary series. 5-10 minutes each night for 5 nights. You can say whatever you want in 4 of them, we don't care. But in the 5th one, we have to highlight some of the good and positive work that is being done in this field. You see it in social work. A colleague of mine, Liz Frost, did a European-wide social work project. 50% of social workers, high-risk social workers, burn out and leave the profession within 3 years of joining. A lot of social workers can't deal with the negative consequences that people hear about their profession. We hear about that in probation as well. So I think we need to get out there and give realistic stories and challenge some of the negative stories that we hear. I think this is also important as well. So the first one is the scientific methods. Here are the facts. What conclusions can we draw from them? We call that evidence-based policy and practice. And, we see that more frequently in some governments, and we see that more frequently in some countries than we do in others. Then we have the political method. Here's the conclusions. What facts can we draw from it? What facts can we find to support it? And we have all seen that, haven't we? Where someone comes up with a policy and says, go and find me some evidence to support this. This isn't what we should be doing. We should be focusing on the evidence base. And yeah, the evidence base might be a bit shaky in places, and we mightn't have 27 randomized control trials. But actually, we've got to look at what the intervention is, where it's at, and what it's trying to do. And we should be evidence-based. We should be informed because we've got a growing body of evidence. We know what certain factors are, and that's important. The one thing that I will say, though, is academics are terrible. Academics are terrible at this, and professionals can sometimes be bad at this. You have to understand the policy process. If you write a book or write an article, no one is going to read it. I was once at a meeting with a governor of a prison where an academic colleague brought a copy of their book for the governor to read in the meeting. And you're like, that's not going to happen. Why are you doing that? If you talk to people who work in policy, they talk about things like, well, I have to do a 1-pager for the minister. I've got 10 minutes to convince them of this thing. And you know what? You have to speak the language that they speak. You have to give them what they need to hear in a way that they want to hear it, and not simply bring 17 of your articles with you. One of the things that we've found that's been quite interesting, we did a workshop in Bristol, and we're going to do another one in London in about 6 weeks about the service user voice. And service users and that story and that narrative is actually quite important. And for people to be able to see the consequences of policies and practice, so you need research, but you need a wide variety of evidence bases. And you know your department's better than anyone else, and you know your policymakers better than anyone else. And so you have to think about actually what will they respond to and adapt the conversation and the evidence base to help you think about it and to help them get to a point that they need to get to. So just sort of in closing, how do we do this? We need engagement, we need research, we need public and media engagement and professional engagement. We as experts need to own our expertise, and we need to be able to go forward and say, actually, we know that sexual abuse, that the vast majority of people who are victims of sexual abuse know their perpetrator. We know that it's related to life course issues, including mental health, adverse childhood experiences. We know it's situational and contextual. We know what the victimization risk factors are, and we know what the perpetration risk factors are. So let's think about how we can work together to prevent it, but then also to stop it from happening again and to work towards integrating individuals into communities upon release. And that's basically what that slide says. So I'm going to be quiet. And is there any questions?
It strikes me, I'm just thinking of my own situation and our own minister and the power to change that narrative, that the key people to do that are survivors organisations. And I think the big challenge for us in the probation services in Ireland is to become more attuned with victims and survivors, so that our whole practice is imbued with the experience of victims as well. And I think, just take it back in terms of what's recently happened. Yeah. You mentioned the recent case and some stuff that's happened around that. There's been a couple of media exposure, if you like, or discussions where our survivors have been on, and the power of their voice, I think, is the way that we're going to find a change that you're
So I'll just repeat what Brian said there. So Brian said that one of the challenges is how you bring victims and survivors on board and how that can work with probation to create that narrative. And I completely agree with you. One of the problems that we have found in this field is there's an artificial divide sometimes between victims charities and agents of the state, but also perpetration and treatment charities. And actually, we are all on the same page. And I would argue that it is artificial divides. So I, earlier this year, went and spoke at the National Sexual Assault Conference in the US. They now have, it's the biggest victim advocate conference, and they now have a stream dedicated to the risk management of people who have committed sexual offenses. And I'd heard all these stories before I went that actually they might be quite confrontational with you, they might challenge you, they mightn't want to hear what you've got to say. The workshop, I say workshop, had 180 people show up, and they all wanted to learn. They all wanted to find out more. And actually coming away from it, they were saying our experiences aren't that different. And the big challenge, and I think you're right about this, the big challenge is you need to look at the complexity of offending in relationships. So you have someone who's committed sexual abuse against their children. Their children will say, I still love my father. I still want my father in my life, but I can't get past what my father has done to me and to my siblings. And I think by working together with victims charities, that's the only way that we can navigate these problems. So I think that you're right, and I think that that is a challenge. But I think that we're probably closer together than we are further apart. But yeah. So you can either ask me some questions up at the front, or you can get in the queue and be 5 minutes early for lunch. I don't want to take you away from lunch. I understand that that's, you know, you organize these things, but we know you're all here for the lunch. I've been to enough. So I just want to say thank you for coming and thanks for listening to me. And if you want to contact me, I'll give you my email address. Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant. I hope so. Oh, thank you. When they say, "Oh, it didn't work," that's not really what it said. Actually, don't quite be offended. Yes, but it wasn't the same. You found out it's different. What do you think? They want to know what domestic violence, they want to know something else. The other night, or actually, not only do they specialists, but you also need support. They didn't have it. And if you have the feed, there's so many.